December 18, 1942. A freight train cut through the Bavarian Alps under a bruised sky, its engine groaning like an exhausted animal. Snow swept across its steel skin, hissing as it met the warmth of the boiler. Inside one of its armored cars, a single wooden crate sat secured with iron bands. It was barely the size of a footlocker, but its contents were treated as sacred. Inside were precision ball bearings, hundreds of them, each polished to a mirror's edge, each destined for the Messerschmitt factory in Augsburg. To the Reich, they were worth more than gold. In the dim light of a signal lantern, a young German engineer named Otto Kramer leaned against the crate and rubbed his hands together for warmth. He was 27, brilliant, and already exhausted by a war that refused to end. His task was simple on paper: ensure these bearings reached the factory safely. In practice, it was an act of desperation. The factories at Schweinfurt, the heart of Germany's bearing production, had been running around the clock, but even the most efficient machines could not meet the demand. Bearings for aircraft engines, bearings for tanks, bearings for the rockets Hitler promised would win the war. Every machine, from the humble Panzer to the deadly Messerschmitt, depended on them. Otto had seen what happened when one failed. He'd watched an aircraft engine seize mid-flight because a single bearing overheated and shattered. The pilot never had a chance. Precision was everything, and precision was slipping through their fingers. When he arrived at the Augsburg plant, the air was thick with oil and smoke. Men worked under the glare of hanging lamps, their faces drawn and hollow. The war had stolen their youth and replaced it with fatigue. Engineers pored over blueprints with trembling hands. "The tolerances are too tight," one muttered. "We can't hold the precision." Another snapped back, "Then tighten the men, not the machines." Their voices were brittle, sharp with fear. In his office overlooking the factory floor, Dr. Wilhelm Schreiber, chief of mechanical design, sat hunched over a drafting table. He was one of Hitler's best minds, or so the Ministry of Armaments liked to say. In truth, he was a weary man who had once dreamed of building locomotives. Now he built engines for warplanes. Before him lay a dismantled bearing assembly, its races scored, its cage fractured. He ran his fingers over the metal, feeling the tiny imperfections. A single scratch could doom an entire engine. "We are building cathedrals," he murmured, "with sand for stone." Otto entered quietly, removing his cap. "The shipment arrived, Herr Doctor." "Good," Schreiber said without looking up. "How many are usable?" "Perhaps half. The rest are inconsistent." Schreiber sighed. "Inconsistent. Always inconsistent." He rose slowly and crossed to the window, watching sparks leap from the welders' torches below. "The Führer demands engines that can climb to 10,000 meters and not fail. But these bearings, these cursed bearings, they crumble like biscuits." Otto hesitated. "Perhaps if we had more chromium or better grinding machines." "We've requisitioned every ton of chromium in Europe," Schreiber interrupted. "And our grinders? They're running themselves to death." "No, Otto. The problem isn't the metal. It's us." Outside, the factory sirens wailed. Allied bombers were sighted again over Stuttgart. Workers scattered for the shelters. Schreiber remained by the window, unmoving. "You know," he said softly, "we used to say German engineering could solve anything. But this is different. Nature doesn't yield to pride." As the bombs fell miles away, the glass in the windows trembled. Otto imagined the train tracks twisting, the machines going silent, the bearings melting in the fire. Somewhere in London, or maybe Washington, men were reading reports that said the German war machine was a masterpiece of precision. If only they knew how fragile it truly was. That night, as the factory slept, Schreiber stayed at his desk. He drew diagrams of turbine blades, scribbled equations for heat transfer, then crossed them out in frustration. He knew the Americans were working on similar problems. Rumors said they had developed turbosuperchargers that let their bombers climb higher, fly faster, survive longer. He refused to believe it until a captured B-17 engine arrived for inspection. The engine was heavy and crude by German standards. But when Schreiber's team disassembled it, they found something extraordinary. The bearings were perfect. Not delicate, not over-engineered, just perfect enough to survive. Each part bore the mark of mass production, not artistry, yet the system worked flawlessly. He stared at them for a long time, running his fingers over their smooth surfaces. "They've done it," he whispered. "The Americans have solved it." The realization hit him harder than any bomb. While his team had been perfecting theory, the Americans had perfected production. They had found a way to build machines that were not just precise, but reproducible, a miracle of practicality that Germany's proud craftsmen could not match. Later, in his private notes, Schreiber wrote, "They have achieved what we cannot. They make genius ordinary." The irony was unbearable. The Reich's greatest weakness was not lack of intellect, but its obsession with perfection. German engineers built machines that worked only when crafted by masters. American engineers built machines anyone could assemble, and that was the difference between collapse and victory. Weeks later, Otto walked through the factory again. New orders had come down from Berlin. Increased production, no excuses. The men worked longer hours, the air filled with the screech of overworked lathes. One day, a bearing shattered during testing, sending shards across the floor. A mechanic swore under his breath. Otto picked up a fragment. Its surface burned black. "It overheated again," he said. Schreiber looked at the shard, then at Otto. "Do you know what we are missing?" "A miracle?" Otto tried to smile. Schreiber shook his head. "No. A system." He knew then that the war was already lost, not because Germany lacked courage or intelligence, but because it lacked adaptability. They were craftsmen in a world that now belonged to engineers. Outside, snow began to fall again, silent and relentless. The trains kept running, each carrying its precious cargo of bearings to factories already doomed. Otto stood by the loading dock, watching the smoke from the chimneys twist into the gray sky. Somewhere beyond the clouds, Allied bombers circled. Somewhere across the ocean, men in denim jackets and oil-stained gloves were solving problems that he and Schreiber could not. He thought of them, not as enemies, but as rivals who had mastered a language he barely understood, the language of scale, of simplicity, of efficiency without ego. He wondered what it would be like to work in such a place, where ideas mattered more than orders, where a good design could save lives instead of destroy them. As he turned to leave, the foreman shouted over the wind, "Herr Kramer, the next shipment must leave by dawn." Otto nodded, his breath fogging in the cold. "Yes," he said quietly, "by dawn." In the east, the first light was already breaking, pale and uncertain. The war machine still moved, still roared, but somewhere deep inside, the gears were grinding down. The bearings would keep turning for a while longer, but the sound they made now, faint, uneven, inevitable, was the sound of defeat. And far across the ocean, in a factory humming through the night, another set of hands turned another wheel, chasing the same perfection and finding it. The air in Schenectady, New York, smelled of coal smoke and iron dust. In the winter of 1942, the General Electric plant there never slept. Its walls trembled with the rhythm of industry, lathes grinding, turbines whining, steam hissing like an impatient orchestra. At the center of that mechanical storm stood Dr. Sanford Moss, a man whose voice was as quiet as the machines were loud. He was 58, balding, with spectacles that constantly fogged in the factory heat. Few of the young engineers believed that this soft-spoken man, with his slow gait and mild eyes, had once been the first to build a working turbo-supercharger. But Moss had no interest in legend. His eyes were on the charts pinned to the wall: altitude, temperature, efficiency. Numbers were his battlefield. He had been called back to service by the War Department, though service here meant equations instead of rifles. The problem was simple to describe and almost impossible to solve: build an engine that could breathe in the thin air above 25,000 feet. The Germans had tried and failed. Their turbines melted or froze. The British struggled, their engines gasping at altitude. The Americans had the resources, but not yet the precision. Moss was told, in the clipped tone of a colonel who understood nothing of science, that the bombers must fly higher and faster, or boys will keep dying. Every engineer at GE knew what that meant. Their machines, built for reliability and power, were now expected to defy physics itself. Turbines that spun at 30,000 revolutions per minute had to survive in temperatures swinging from 2,000 degrees to 40 below zero. Bearings had to endure friction that could liquefy steel. There was no room for failure. Among Moss's team was a young engineer named Bill Thornton, 26, sharp-tongued and restless. He had studied under Moss at Cornell and now found himself elbow-deep in turbine grease, wondering why theory never mentioned the smell of burnt oil. Bill admired Moss, though he couldn't understand the man's calm. "How can you drink coffee while the world's on fire?" he once asked. Moss had smiled faintly. "Because if we panic, Bill, the fire wins." Their workspace looked more like a blacksmith's den than a laboratory, pipes snaking across the floor, half-dismantled compressors laid open like dissected beasts. The noise was constant, drills screaming, hammers striking, the endless hiss of cooling steam. Yet within that chaos, Moss worked with the precision of a surgeon. He rarely raised his voice, never used more words than necessary. When he spoke, the room listened. "The Germans have the Me-262, he said one evening, tracing a spiral on the chalkboard. "Jet propulsion. But they cannot keep the engines from tearing themselves apart. The metallurgy fails." "And us?" Bill asked. "We're close. But our bearings seize at high altitude. The oil crystallizes." "Then change the oil." Moss gave him a look that was neither amused nor angry. "If it were that simple, we'd be done already. Every solution creates a new problem. The trick is to make the last problem survivable." The air in Schenectady, New York, smelled of coal smoke and iron dust. In the winter of 1942, the General Electric plant there never slept. Its walls trembled with the rhythm of industry, lathes grinding, turbines whining, steam hissing like an impatient orchestra. At the center of that mechanical storm stood Dr. Sanford Moss, a man whose voice was as quiet as the machines were loud. He was 58, balding, with spectacles that constantly fogged in the factory heat. Few of the young engineers believed that this soft-spoken man, with his slow gait and mild eyes, had once been the first to build a working turbo-supercharger. But Moss had no interest in legend. His eyes were on the charts pinned to the wall: altitude, temperature, efficiency. Numbers were his battlefield. He had been called back to service by the War Department, though service here meant equations instead of rifles. The problem was simple to describe and almost impossible to solve: build an engine that could breathe in the thin air above 25,000 feet. The Germans had tried and failed. Their turbines melted or froze. The British struggled, their engines gasping at altitude. The Americans had the resources, but not yet the precision. Moss was told, in the clipped tone of a colonel who understood nothing of science, that the bombers must fly higher and faster, or boys will keep dying. Every engineer at GE knew what that meant. Their machines, built for reliability and power, were now expected to defy physics itself. Turbines that spun at 30,000 revolutions per minute had to survive in temperatures swinging from 2,000 degrees to 40 below zero. Bearings had to endure friction that could liquefy steel. There was no room for failure. Among Moss's team was a young engineer named Bill Thornton, 26, sharp-tongued and restless. He had studied under Moss at Cornell and now found himself elbow-deep in turbine grease, wondering why theory never mentioned the smell of burnt oil. Bill admired Moss, though he couldn't understand the man's calm. "How can you drink coffee while the world's on fire?" he once asked. Moss had smiled faintly. "Because if we panic, Bill, the fire wins." Their workspace looked more like a blacksmith's den than a laboratory, pipes snaking across the floor, half-dismantled compressors laid open like dissected beasts. The noise was constant, drills screaming, hammers striking, the endless hiss of cooling steam. Yet within that chaos, Moss worked with the precision of a surgeon. He rarely raised his voice, never used more words than necessary. When he spoke, the room listened. "The Germans have the Me-262, he said one evening, tracing a spiral on the chalkboard. "Jet propulsion. But they cannot keep the engines from tearing themselves apart. The metallurgy fails." "And us?" Bill asked. "We're close. But our bearings seize at high altitude. The oil crystallizes." "Then change the oil." Moss gave him a look that was neither amused nor angry. If it were that simple, we'd be done already. Every solution creates a new problem. The trick is to make the last problem survivable. He returned to his calculations, and Bill went back to his workbench, muttering that sometimes it felt like they were building the Tower of Babel, reaching too high, destined to fall. But Moss's patience was infectious. Even when experiments failed, and they failed often, he treated each one as a clue rather than a defeat. Outside the factory, the town pulsed with war. Posters urged workers to build for victory. Cafes served coffee that tasted faintly of rust. Women in overalls streamed into the plants each dawn, their hair tied in scarves, their hands calloused from machinery. The line between soldier and civilian had blurred. Everyone fought, some with wrenches instead of rifles. One of them was Ruth McMillan, 22, who had joined the GE plant after her brother's bomber was shot down over Bremen. She operated a precision lathe, grinding turbine shafts to within 0.2 of an inch. The work was hypnotic, the whirring blade reflecting the faint light like a star. Ruth had never met Moss, but she knew of him. The foreman spoke his name like a spell. Dr. Moss says this, Dr. Moss needs that. For her, the war was personal. Every flawless bearing she produced was a promise that another pilot might come home. Late one night, as snow fell outside the factory windows, Moss stood over the test chamber. Inside, a prototype turbocharger screamed to life. Flames licked its casing. The air shimmered from heat. The gauge needles trembled, then steadied. He watched the numbers climb. 25,000 feet simulated altitude. 28,000. 30,000. The bearing temperature held. For the first time, it didn't fail. Bill grinned through the smoke. You did it. Moss shook his head. We did something. Whether it's enough, we'll see. The next morning, the test results went to Washington. Within weeks, word came back. Install them on the B-17s and B-24s immediately. The American bombers would now fly higher than the Luftwaffe could reach. The engineers cheered, but Moss only exhaled slowly, as though he'd been holding his breath for months. Now we wait, he said. If the engines live, the men live. But success brought new pressure. Production had to scale, and precision had to become routine. GE's factories in Lynn, Massachusetts, and Erie, Pennsylvania, were drafted into the effort. Thousands of workers trained overnight to handle tolerances they'd never imagined. Mistakes were not just costly, they were deadly. Moss spent his days traveling between plants, answering questions, calming tempers. He was no longer just an inventor, he had become the conscience of an industrial army. Bill grew bolder with each success. We're ahead of them, sir. The Germans can't match this output. Moss studied him for a long moment. Never underestimate desperation, he said quietly. They'll try again. They always do. Meanwhile, Ruth worked double shifts, her hands raw from coolant and steel dust. She sometimes caught herself daydreaming about the bombers she'd helped send skyward, their engines roaring like living things. One evening, she found a newspaper clipping on the breakroom table, Schweinfurt bombed, ball-bearing factories in ruins. She read it twice, heart pounding. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe the war might actually end. Yet Moss felt no triumph. When he read the same headline, he only saw the faces of men like Otto Kramer, though he didn't know his name, engineers fighting their own losing battle across the ocean. He knew their kind, their pride, their hunger for perfection. We didn't outsmart them, he told Bill one night. We outproduced them. But don't mistake scale for superiority. Bill frowned. Isn't winning enough? For the war, yes, Moss replied. For humanity, I'm not so sure. The two men stood in silence, the factory humming around them like a great living heart. Somewhere, an air raid siren wailed in Europe. Somewhere else, a B-17 climbed above the clouds, its engines holding steady. Moss turned off the lights in the test room and looked out at the falling snow. Perfection, he said softly, is not what wins wars. Persistence does. He didn't know it yet, but his invention would outlast the war itself. The same turbines that powered bombers would soon power civilian planes, then electricity for entire cities. What began as an act of necessity would become the foundation of modern aviation. For now, though, there was only the factory, the endless hum of machines, and the faint, metallic scent of hope. Ruth finished her shift and stepped into the snow. Moss returned to his equations. Bill leaned over the test engine, adjusting a valve until the hum deepened to a steady purr. Across the Atlantic, the sky above Germany burned red. The engineers there still searched for perfection, still believed they could build their way out of defeat. But in America, perfection had already taken a different form, ordinary men and women, building the extraordinary together. And though no one said it aloud, they all felt it, that somewhere in the roar of the turbines, the tide of the war had begun to turn. August 17, 1943. The dawn sky above England was pale and deceptive, soft light over a field of thunder. On the runways of the 8th Air Force, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses lined up wing to wing, their silver bodies glinting like scales of a rising beast. Ground crews hurried beneath them, tightening bolts, loading bombs, checking oxygen lines. Inside each aircraft, engines roared to life, their turbo-superchargers whining with the force of contained storms. To the men preparing to fly into Germany, those sounds were a promise. The machines would hold, the bearings would endure, and they would come home again. Captain Robert "Bobby" Hale, 24, sat in the cockpit of his B-17, nicknamed Liberty Bell. He wiped sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. The morning was cool, but his nerves weren't. It was his 15th mission, this time to Schweinfurt, the city that supplied nearly every ball bearing to Hitler's war machine. "They say if we knock out Schweinfurt," his co-pilot muttered, "the whole Reich grinds to a halt." Bobby nodded but didn't answer. He'd heard that before. The Germans always seemed to find a way to keep fighting. Still, he trusted his engines. The men in Schenectady had built them, the same men who worked through nights, fueled by coffee and patriotism. He thought of them sometimes, faceless but vital, like the pulse behind the heartbeat. The order came through the radio: all groups, take off. The first bombers lumbered forward, then lifted, heavy and determined. The sky filled with formation after formation, stretching toward the horizon, 1,000 engines hammering in unison. From the ground, it must have looked like a moving wall of iron. From inside, it felt like flying into a storm made of flak and fire. Hours later, over Germany, that storm found them. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire bloomed around the bombers like poisonous flowers. The air smelled of cordite and fear. Shrapnel tore through aluminum, engines sputtered, and the intercom filled with static and prayer. Bobby's bomber shuddered as a shell exploded nearby, peppering the right wing. Warning lights blinked across the panel, but the engines held. He could feel the steady hum through the control column, the sound of those bearings spinning flawlessly at 30,000 revolutions per minute. Somewhere deep inside the machine, an engineer's precision was keeping them alive. At the same moment, hundreds of miles below, Otto Kramer stood outside a shelter in Schweinfurt, staring at the contrails threading across the sky. The sirens wailed again. He had barely slept since the last raid. The Allied bombers came with merciless regularity now, targeting what little remained of the bearing factories. The air smelled of burning oil and brick dust. He could see the workers running toward the tunnels, clutching helmets and gas masks. He didn't move. "Again," he said under his breath. "They've come again." Dr. Wilhelm Schreiber emerged beside him, pale and unshaven. "They've chosen well," he said grimly. "If they destroy these plants, our tanks, our planes, everything stops." "Can we move the machinery?" Otto asked, though he already knew the answer. "There's nowhere left to move it." Schreiber watched the bombers growing larger, sunlight glinting off their wings. "I told Berlin months ago. We cannot fight a war on precision alone." The first explosions rolled through the city, flattening entire blocks. Dust and flame surged into the air. Otto was thrown to the ground by the shockwave. When he rose, the main assembly hall was gone, only twisted metal and a crater remained. He stumbled toward the ruins, choking on smoke. The machines that had taken years to perfect lay buried under rubble. A single bearing, blackened but unbroken, rolled across the floor and came to rest against his boot. He picked it up, trembling, So small, he whispered, and yet it decides everything. High above, Bobby's bomber released its payload. The plane jolted upward as the bombs fell away, disappearing through the haze below. The gunner in the tail called out, "Direct hits. Factories are burning." The crew cheered, but Bobby didn't. He could see the fires blooming beneath them, could imagine the men who worked there, engineers, mechanics, maybe even dreamers like himself. The war demanded destruction, but he still felt the weight of what that meant. When Liberty Bell turned for home, one engine began to sputter. Oil pressure dropped. A bearing had finally given out. Smoke trailed behind the plane as it limped toward the channel. Bobby's hands clenched the yoke. "Come on, sweetheart," he muttered. "Don't die on me now." The remaining engines strained, their turbochargers screaming. Every vibration ran up through the floor, through his arms, into his bones. The entire crew went silent, listening to the rhythm of survival. Back in Germany, Schreiber stood amid the wreckage. The fires burned into the night, painting the sky in infernal orange. He and Otto helped dig survivors from the rubble, their hands black with soot. The factory that had once sung with the precision of 1,000 machines was now silent. "This was our cathedral," Schreiber said hoarsely. "And they have turned it to dust." Otto looked at him. "Then the war is over." Schreiber shook his head slowly. "No. The war will go on. But our hope will not." In the weeks that followed, Germany's production plummeted. Bearings were salvaged from wrecked vehicles, melted down, reused. The Reich's engineers grew desperate, experimenting with substitutes that never worked. Speer's reports to Hitler became increasingly frantic. Without bearings, engines seized, gearboxes failed, aircraft fell from the sky. Every attempt to restart production met with Allied bombs. The miracle of German precision had become a curse. It could not be replaced, could not be improvised. Across the ocean, in Schenectady, the news reached the GE plant. Workers crowded around the bulletin board to read the headline, "U.S. Bombers Cripple Bearing Industry." Bill Thornton read it twice, then found Moss in the test room, studying a new compressor design. "We did it," Bill said. "Schweinfurt's gone. Their supplies finished." Moss didn't look up. "Then the killing will slow," he murmured. Bill hesitated. "You don't sound proud." "I'm an engineer, not a soldier. When I solve a problem, I like to see something built, not destroyed." He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Still, it had to be done. Later that night, Moss sat alone in his office, staring at a small model turbine on his desk. He thought of the men across the ocean, men who had loved machinery as he did, men now buried beneath their creations. He wondered if any of them had looked up at the sky and recognized the sound of his engines. The war had proven that technology could decide the fate of nations, but it had also shown him how fragile genius could be when chained to ideology. Meanwhile, Otto and Schreiber were transferred to a smaller plant outside Munich, working with whatever tools remained. They repaired engines scavenged from wreckage, improvising with parts that no longer fit. Each night, the sky thundered with the sound of bombers they could not stop. Schreiber wrote in his notebook, his handwriting trembling, "The Americans build miracles by the thousands. We build ruins by hand." The balance had shifted irrevocably. The Allies now owned the skies. The engineers in America had not just solved a technical puzzle, they had rewritten the meaning of industrial power. What once required artisans now required organization, discipline, and imagination. One evening, Otto held up a broken bearing, its surface dull and scarred. "We used to think we were the future," he said quietly. "But the future has moved on without us." Schreiber nodded. "And it speaks English." Outside, Allied bombers droned overhead, engines steady and unyielding. The sound reached the two men like a distant heartbeat, a reminder that somewhere beyond the darkness, the problem they had failed to solve had already been conquered. And in that sound, both knew the war of machines had already been won. June 6, 1944. The world trembled. Over the gray waters of the English Channel, the largest armada in history pressed toward Normandy. Warships boomed like thunder gods, and above them, waves of bombers cut through the clouds, their engines a relentless roar. Each aircraft was a miracle of American engineering. 4 engines per plane, each one spun by a heart of steel born from the minds of men who never saw the front lines. Inside one of those bombers, Captain Robert Hale gripped the control yoke of Liberty Bell, his knuckles pale. The sea below glittered with the chaos of invasion, ships burning, shells bursting, men fighting to reach the sand. "We're right on time," his co-pilot shouted over the noise. "Engines steady." Robert nodded. The gauges held steady, the hum deep and smooth. He knew the sound intimately now. It was the sound of faith rewarded, the echo of thousands of hands back home who had made sure this moment could exist. In Schenectady, the same morning, the GE plant shook with a different kind of thunder. The war had turned from desperate defense to unstoppable offense, and every worker felt it. Posters that once pleaded for sacrifice now promised victory. Ruth McMillan stood by her lathe, running a fingertip along the polished curve of a turbine blade. Her shift had begun before dawn, but she refused to feel tired. "They're flying today," said her foreman, passing by. "Over France. D-Day." The words sank into her chest like a drumbeat. She'd been building for this day for 3 years, each bearing, each bolt, a prayer cast in metal. She pictured one of those bombers over the beach, its engines alive with the parts she'd made. The thought made her eyes sting. Dr. Sanford Moss was in Washington that same morning, summoned for a briefing with the Army Air Forces. The war was entering its final act, and the generals wanted numbers. Moss had never liked numbers detached from people, but he gave them anyway. "Our superchargers have logged over 1 million cumulative flight hours," he said. "Engine failure rate is under 1%. The general across the table smiled grimly. "That's 1% fewer widows, Doctor." Moss only nodded. He thought of the engineers who had died in testing accidents, the sleepless nights, the quiet sacrifices made far from battlefields. He thought of Ruth and the countless others who had given their youth to steel and precision. Victory, he realized, was not the work of heroes but of persistence, millions of ordinary hands refusing to falter. Meanwhile, in a shattered factory outside Munich, Otto Kramer adjusted his glasses and stared at the cracked gearbox before him. The Reich was dying around him, cities in ruins, fuel nearly gone, factories silent. Yet he worked still, because to stop would mean admitting defeat. Dr. Wilhelm Schreiber stood beside him, older and slower now, his once steady hands trembling. "Berlin has fallen silent," Schreiber said quietly. "Even the Ministry of Armaments doesn't answer." Otto didn't look up. "We can still fix this machine," he said. The denial in his voice was thin, almost childlike. Schreiber sighed. "There will be no more machines. Not after this." He touched the warped metal gently, almost tenderly. "We built the future, Otto, and then we burned it." That night, the two men shared a bottle of cheap schnapps under the dim light of a flickering lamp. The air was heavy with ash. "Do you know what I envy?" Otto asked. "Their simplicity. The Americans made genius look effortless." Schreiber chuckled weakly. "We made effort look genius." They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the distant rumble of bombers. The same engines, the same turbines that had once terrified them, now heralded the end. "If there is a God," Schreiber said softly, "he must have a sense of irony." Days later, Allied troops marched through the wreckage of German industry. They found machines half-built, blueprints burned, factories stripped bare. Among them were crates of half-finished bearings, beautifully made, useless without their missing pairs. American engineers studied them with quiet respect. Moss received one of those bearings months later, a gift from a soldier who'd known his work. He held it in his palm, feeling the precision of its polish, the perfection that had come too late. It reminded him of Otto, though he didn't know his name, of every mind consumed by a war that demanded genius for destruction. By the spring of 1945, the air war was over. Hitler was dead. The factories in Schenectady turned from weapons to peace. Moss was asked to oversee the conversion of military turbines into civilian power generators. He accepted, though he felt an ache he couldn't quite name. One evening, as the sun set over the Hudson, he walked through the now quiet plant. The walls still smelled faintly of oil and steel, but the noise had gone. Workers were sweeping the floors, singing softly. Ruth was among them. She looked up as Moss passed, surprised to see the man whose ideas had defined their lives. "You're Dr. Moss," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "We used to joke that you never slept." He smiled faintly. "I didn't, not much." She hesitated, then asked, "Was it worth it?" Moss looked around the vast, echoing space. "Every life it saved," he said finally, "was worth every sleepless night." He paused, then added, "But we must remember what we built and why. The same engines that lifted men above the clouds could just as easily burn the earth beneath them." Ruth nodded. She understood. They all did. That night, Moss returned to his office and found the bearing from Germany still on his desk. He placed it beside an American-made one, nearly identical in size. He turned them both in his hands, the same steel, the same shine, yet separated by everything that mattered. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, softly, almost to himself, he murmured, "We solved the problem, thus. But what problem did we truly solve?" In Germany, Otto survived the surrender and walked through the ruins of Munich, his engineer's mind still cataloging damage, still searching for what could be rebuilt. He found one of his old bearings in the rubble, pitted but intact. He pocketed it. Years later, he would tell his son that he kept it not as a symbol of defeat, but as a reminder of what men can create when they believe too much in perfection. "Machines don't fail," he would say. "People do, when they forget why they build." By 1947, Moss's turbochargers had been adapted for commercial aircraft. The same technology that once powered bombers now carried passengers peacefully across oceans. The world was learning to fly again, this time without fear. On a clear spring morning, Moss watched a DC-4 lift off from LaGuardia Airport, its engines humming with familiar grace. He felt pride, yes, but also something like sorrow. The sound of progress and the sound of war, he realized, were too similar to tell apart. Ruth read about the flight in the paper that same day. She smiled as she poured her morning coffee, thinking of the engines she'd helped make. Somewhere in that airplane, a piece of her labor was still alive. The war had taken so much, but it had also proved something she would never forget, that ordinary people, given purpose, could move the world. As for Moss, he spent his final years teaching young engineers not just how to build, but how to think. Precision, he told them, is not just a matter of measurement. It's a matter of meaning. Build something that lasts not because it can, but because it should. He died in 1946, quietly, at his desk, a blueprint still open beside him. On that blueprint, circled in pencil, was a single note: "Efficiency is mercy." Years later, in a museum case in Washington, a single ball bearing gleamed beneath the glass. One label read, "Recovered from Schweinfurt, 1943. Beside it, another, "Manufactured by General Electric, 1942. Two worlds, one circle of steel, one born of tyranny, the other of freedom." And together, they told a truth no bomb could erase, that sometimes the smallest things hold up the weight of history.